Hey guys, tonight we are taking a trip back in time, and not to one of those glamorous, sword and sandal destinations. No, we are going somewhere a bit more pungent. We are headed to the heart of the 19th century Industrial Revolution London. Forget the elegant drawings in history books of ladies with parasols and gentlemen in top hats. We are going to the real London, the one you can smell from 5 miles away. Honestly, your 21st century sensibilities might not survive the first day, but that's what makes it fun, right? It's an adventure in grime. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are at it, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice isn't a sight, but a smell. You are on a slow, chugging passenger boat, making its way up the River Thames. The air, which should be fresh and salty this close to the estuary, is thick and heavy. It is a complex cocktail, a layered assault on your senses. The dominant note is coal smoke, a sharp, acrid, sulfur house blanket that coats the back of your throat and makes your eyes water. It pours from 1,000 chimneys on the riverbank, turning the sky into a permanent, hazy shroud of brownish gray. Even on a sunny day, the light struggles to pierce through, casting a strangely muted, almost sepia-toned glow on everything. You try to breathe through your mouth. A rookie mistake. That just introduces the next layer. It is an organic, earthy smell of manure, so pervasive it is almost a background hum. The city has foundational set, with an estimated 50 jar horses working in London, each producing a significant amount of waste every day. The streets are essentially paved with it, but beneath the smoke and the manure, there is something else. Something uniquely foul coming from the very water your boat is churning through. It is the river itself. You glance over the side and see not clear water, but a murky, brown soup, thick with floating debris you would rather not identify. This is the main artery of London, and it also serves as its main sewer. This is our first major, historical point of the night. Before a unified sewage system, everything ended up in the Thames. Waste from homes, effluent from factories, offal from slaughterhouses, and the chemical runoff from tanneries all bled directly into the river. You are currently floating on a waterway that is carrying the filth of over 2 million people. The people around you on the boat, however, seem completely unfazed. A man in a worn wool coat reads a newspaper, his face impassive. A mother coaxes a child to look at the factories lining the bank. They are nose blind, so accustomed to the stench that it no longer registers. You are the anomaly, the one whose body is screaming that this environment is fundamentally wrong. And here is a little-known detail for you. Different industries contributed their own unique notes to this symphony of smells. As you pass by Bermondsey on the south bank, a particularly sharp, ammonial tang hits you. This was the heart of London's tanning industry, where leather was processed using vats of dog feces and stale urine to soften the hides. A little further up, you might catch the stomach-turning scent of boiling animal bones from a glue factory, or the metallic, coppery smell from a butcher's abattoir losing its floors into a tributary. A great stink is a famous event we will get to later, but the everyday stink was a constant, complex, and oppressive presence. Historians still debate the true psychological impact this sensory overload had on people migrating from the countryside. We have letters and diary entries describing the shock, but it is difficult to fully capture the transition from the green, open fields of rural England to this dense, suffocated, man-made environment? Was it a slow descent into acceptance, or a brutal, soul-crushing shock on day one? The sheer, inescapable nature of the grime and the noise was a form of violence against the senses that we can only imagine. As your boat finally nudges against a bustling dock, the noise, which was a dull roar from the water, becomes a deafening cacophony. The shouts of dockworkers, the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones, the nigging of stressed horses, and the constant, thrumming hum of nearby machinery all blend into one overwhelming wall of sound. You step off the gangplank onto stones slick with a combination of mud, river water, and things you try not to think about. You're immediately jostled by a dense crowd of people, a moving river of bodies that seems to have no beginning or end. You pull your coat a little tighter, take a shallow, smoky breath, and stand there for a moment, utterly overwhelmed. Your first task in this magnificent, terrible city is simply to find a room for the night. And as you will soon discover, what lies beneath the floorboards of that room is a whole other story. You push away from the dock, plunging into the labyrinth. The streets here are not grand avenues. They are narrow, winding canyons carved between towering, soot-blackened brick buildings. They lean in towards each other at the top, almost touching, blotting out what little light penetrates the smoky sky. The ground beneath your feet is a treacherous landscape. There are cobblestones, but they are mostly hidden beneath a layer of thick, black, sticky mud. It is a foul concoction of dirt, horse manure, and spilled waste, clinging to your boots with a disgusting sucking sound. You have to walk with your head down, not just to watch your step, but to avoid the contents of chamber pots that are casually tossed from upper-story windows with a shouted warning of Gardy-Loo. If you are lucky, your mission is to find lodging, and cheap lodging means heading deeper into the rookeries, the city's most densely packed and impoverished neighborhoods. You find a tenement building, a grim structure at least 5 stories high, teeming with life. The doorway is a dark maw, and the air in the shared staircase is stale smells of unwashed bodies, boiled cabbage, and damn broth. You find a landlord willing to rent you a space, not even a full room, but a corner of one, shared with 2 other men who work opposite shifts to you. The room is tiny, with a single, grimy window that looks out onto a brick wall. There is a small fireplace, a lumpy straw mattress on the floor, and a bucket in the corner. That is it. Luxury. As you settle in, trying to block out the sounds of coughing from the next room and a baby crying somewhere below, you become aware of a new smell. It is not the sharp scent of coal smoke or the general muck of the street. This one is deeper, richer, and far more unpleasant. It seems to be coming from beneath the floorboard. A slow, persistent foulness that permeates everything. This, my friend, is your welcome to one of the most fundamental features of Victorian urban living, the cesspool. This is our main historical point for this part of the journey. In most London homes, from the poorest tenements to even some respectable middle-class houses, human waste was flushed away. It was collected in a chamber pot, then dumped into a large, brick-lined pit in the basement or the small backyard. This was the cesspool, or cesspit. In theory, it was a contained system. When the pit got full, it was meant to be emptied. But in reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Landlords, ever keen to save a shilling, would put off emptying them for as long as possible. The brickwork was often old and poorly maintained, meaning the liquid waste would constantly seep out, saturating the very ground your house was built on. Your new home is, quite literally, sitting on a foundation of its own filth. And here is a fascinating, if not nauseating, little-known fact. Emptying these cesspools was a specialized and highly undesirable job. The men who did it work all night soil men. They could only work late at night. By law, to minimize the public nuisance, a team would arrive with a cart, pry open the cover of the cesspool, and ladle the contents out bucket by bucket. A truly horrific task. This night soil, however, was valuable. It was sold to farmers outside the city as a potent fertilizer. So, in a strange, circular economy, the waste of London helped to grow the food that would be brought back to feed London. The problem was, the service was expensive. So in a building like yours, the cesspool was probably only emptied once every year or two, if you were lucky. Until then, it just kept filling up, a festering tank of disease simmering right below you. This leads us to a point that historians still puzzle over. How much did the average person connect these cesspools to illness? The prevailing scientific theory of the day was the miasma theory, the belief that diseases like cholera and typhoid were caused by bad air or foul smells. So, people knew the smell from the cesspool was bad, and they believed that breathing in this miasma was what made them sick. They weren't entirely wrong. The smell was a sign of danger, but they mistook the cause. They focused on fighting the smell with makeshift solutions like burning rosemary or sprinkling carbolic acid, not realizing that the true killer was invisible, seeping from the cesspool into the nearby well from which they drew their drinking water. The debate is whether, on an intuitive level, people made a stronger connection. Did they notice that those living in houses with overflowing cesspits got sick more often, even if they couldn't explain why? Or was the miasma theory so powerful that it completely blinded them to the real transmission vector, right under their feet? For now, you lie on your straw mattress. The cacophony of the city adult roar outside. You try to ignore the faint, sickly sweet smell rising from the floor. You are tired, but sleep feels distant. You are acutely aware that just a few feet below you, separated only by a few wooden planks and a bit of earth, is a vast, subterranean lake of human waste. It is not just in the basement. It is in the soil, in the foundations, a part of the house itself. You have found your lodgings, but you have also found your own personal, ever-present source of filth. A sliver of gray light filters through the grimy window, signaling morning. There is no alarm clock, just the relentless symphony of the city reawakening. The clatter of carts, the distant shriek of a factory whistle, and the sound of your roommates stirring. It is time to perform the morning ritual of washing. You watch one of your roommates, a man named Arthur with a perpetually weary face, pour a small amount of water from a pitcher into a single, small, tin-lined basin. The water is already slightly gray, likely drawn yesterday from a communal pump down the street. He dips his hands in, rubs them on his face, and then uses the corner of a rough, brownish cloth to scrub at his neck and under his arms. He doesn't use soap. Soap is a taxed luxury, something to be used sparingly. Perhaps once a week for laundry, not for daily ablutions. After a few cursory splashes, he is done. He gestures to you. It is your turn. You look at the basin. The water is now cloudy with his grime. This is your introduction to the communal nature of hygiene in the 19th century working class. And it is our central historical point here. Water was precious and scarce, and the concept of a personal, clean wash was almost unheard of. An entire family might wash in sequence using the same small basin of water, which by the end would be a veritable soup. The goal was to be clean in the modern sense. It was a token gesture, a ritual to mark the start of the day, to wipe the sleep and perhaps the worst of the surface soot from your face. It was more about feeling refreshed for a moment than achieving any real level of sanitation. The notion of a daily bath or shower would have been as fantastical as a trip to the moon. The actual process of getting water was a chore in itself. There was no tap in your room. Of course, to get water, you would have to go down several flights of stairs and queue at a communal standpipe or pump in a courtyard or on the street corner. These pumps were often only turned on for a few hours a day, leading to long lines, arguments, and a frantic rush to fill every available bucket, jug, and barrel. The water you carried back up had to last for everything: drinking, cooking, and this morning wash. Wasting it on a thorough, individual scrub was simply not an option. Now for a slightly quirky and less known detail: the tide mark. Because people rarely wash their whole bodies, and when they did, it was usually a sponge bath from a basin. A distinct line would often form on their necks and chests. Above this line was the face, which received a daily wipe. Below this line was the torso, which was rarely washed at all. This visible demarcation of dirt was known colloquially as a tide mark, and it was a common sight, not necessarily a source of shame, but just a fact of life. People were more concerned with the cleanliness of their visible extremities, hands and face, and their outer clothing, like collars and cuffs, than with the overall state of their bodies. This raises a question that social historians still debate. Was this lack of personal washing purely a result of practical limitations? No running water, high cost of fuel for heating, expensive soap, or was there also a different cultural understanding of cleanliness? For centuries, the medical consensus was that bathing too often was dangerous. It was believed that water could open up the pores and allow disease, the dreaded miasma, to enter the body. Doctors often advised against frequent, full immersion bathing, especially in hot water. So, when a working-class person avoided bathing, were they just being practical? Or were they also operating under a lingering cultural and medical belief that it was unhealthy? Distinguishing between economic necessity and cultural norms is tricky, as they often reinforce each other. The poor couldn't afford to bathe often, and the prevailing wisdom, conveniently, told them it was probably for the best. You take your turn at the basin. The cold, grimy water is a shock to your skin. You use a corner of the shared cloth that looks slightly less soiled and quickly wipe your face. It does little to make you feel clean. In fact, you feel a thin film of someone else's dirt being smeared around. But this is the routine. This is the norm. You dry your face on your sleeve because using the shared cloth again seems unbearable. You have completed the first step of your day, a ritual that highlights the vast gulf between the Victorian idea of making oneself presentable and our modern understanding of personal hygiene. Now, it is time to get dressed, and you are about to discover that the clothes you wear are as much a part of this ecosystem of grime as the water in the basin. Now that your wash is complete, it is time to get dressed. There is no closet or wardrobe, just a few hooks on the wall. Your clothes consist of a single set: a rough, collarless shirt made of calico or linsey woolsey, a pair of thick wool trousers, a heavy waistcoat, and a coat. You quickly realize these garments have a life of their own. They are stiff, not just from the coarse fabric, but from an accumulation of sweat, grime, and the ever-present soot. They carry the scent of the city within their fibers: coal smoke, damp, and a faint, musty odor that tells you they have not been properly washed in weeks, or maybe even months. This is the central reality of clothing for the urban poor in the 19th century. You had one set of clothes, and you wore it every day until it literally fell apart. The concept of changing your clothes daily, or even having a separate set of work clothes and evening clothes, was a luxury reserved for the middle and upper classes. Your clothes were your second skin, and just like your own skin, they were rarely subjected to a thorough cleaning. Washing clothes, as we will discover later, was a monumental task. As a result, garments were worn for extended periods, mended repeatedly, and only washed when absolutely necessary. You pull on the shirt. The fabric is scratchy against your skin. As you do, you feel a tiny, tickling sensation on your side. You instinctively reach to scratch it and notice one of your roommates, Arthur, doing the same. A casual, practiced motion as he pulls on his own waistcoat. He catches your eye and gives a slight, knowing nod. This is your introduction to your constant, unwelcome companions. Barty lace, pediculus humanus. They were an accepted, inescapable part of life for a vast portion of the population. This is our specific, slightly unsettling detail for this chapter. Lice weren't seen as a sign of exceptional filth or a medical crisis. They were just a nuisance, a given. They lived, bred, and laid their eggs in the seams of your unwashed clothing, feeding on your blood. People had various folk remedies to deal with them, from rubbing themselves with turpentine or mercury-based ointments, which were often more dangerous than the lice themselves, to the simple, mechanical method of cracking them between thumbnails, a common and audible pastime in quiet moments. The presence of lice was so normal that it wasn't a source of particular shame. It was a shared misery, a common ground. You might complain about a bat infestation, much like you complain about the weather, but you wouldn't be ostracized for it. The historical debate here revolves around the social stratification of parasites. While we know lice were rampant among the poor, how far up the social ladder did they climb? The common assumption is that the wealthy, with their silk undergarments and more frequent washing, were immune. However, some historical accounts and personal letters suggest otherwise. Even in well-to-do households, laundering practices for complex garments were infrequent. In travel, in coaching inns or on ships, could expose anyone to an infestation. Historians argue about whether a wealthy lady complaining of an itch in her diary was referring to a minor skin irritation, or, as is quite possible, was discreetly battling the same foe as the poorest man in the city's rookeries. The cleanliness divide may not have been as absolute as we imagine. Perhaps it was more about having the resources and privacy to deal with the problem more effectively. You fasten your trousers and pull on the waistcoat. The extra layer adds a bit of warmth, which is welcome in the damp room, but it also adds weight and another layer of grime. You feel encased, almost armored, in dirt. The clothes don't feel like a fresh start to the day. They feel like you are putting yesterday's fatigue and filth right back on. There is a strange intimacy in this, a constant physical reminder of your place in this world. Your clothes are a habitat, not just for you, but for a whole microscopic ecosystem. They are a record of your labor, your environment, and your daily life, written in stains and smells. You are now dressed, presentable by the standards of your time and place. You are ready to face the streets, carrying your tiny, uninvited passengers with you. The faint tickle is something you will just have to get used to. It is part of the uniform. You step out of the tenement, back into the dim, narrow street. The air is already thick with activity, and you are immediately forced into a chaotic dance of avoidance. This is your first real navigation of a London street on foot, and it is a full-body, high-stakes experience. The primary challenge, the one that requires your constant attention, is what is underfoot. The slurry of mud and manure we encountered yesterday is not a static thing. It is a flowing, shifting landscape. The iron-rimmed wheels of heavy drays and carts churn it into deep, viscous ruts, and a misstep can send you ankle-deep into a cold, foul-smelling sludge. You learn quickly to walk with a shuffling gait, testing the ground before committing your full weight. This constant negotiation of filth on the streets is our main historical focus. London streets were a repository for everything the city wanted to discard. At the center of many streets was a channel, or kennel, which was the designated gutter. This channel was supposed to carry rainwater, but it was perpetually clogged with a vile mixture of horse urine, discarded vegetable matter from vendors, oyster shells, dead animals, and whatever else was swept out of homes and shops. The smell rising from this central channel was potent. You watch as a woman from a butcher shop casually throws a bucket of bloody water into the street, adding a fresh red slick to the brown canvas. There were no municipal trash cans, so the street was the default option. You quickly become aware of a peculiar hierarchy on the sidewalk, or what passes for one. The area closest to the buildings is slightly more elevated and cleaner. The outer edge, near the curb, is the splash zone, where the wheels of passing vehicles fling up arcs of liquid filth. A gentleman, therefore, always walked on the outside, shielding the lady from the spray. For you, however, it is a free-for-all. You are jostled and pushed by a relentless tide of people, all with the same grim determination on their faces. This brings us to a strange and specific job that existed only because of this filth: the crossing sweeper, at major intersections, where the buildup of mud and manure was particularly deep and treacherous. You see a small figure, often a child or an elderly person, armed with a crude broom made of twigs. This is a crossing sweeper. For a halfpenny, they will frantically sweep a narrow path through the mire for you, allowing you to cross the street without soiling your boots and trousers too badly. They are entrepreneurs of filth, their livelihood dependent on the street being impassable. You see a well-dressed man also going, and a boy darts forward, his broom a blur of motion, clearing a temporary path in the muck. It is a moment of organized cleanliness in a world of chaos. But it is a private transaction, not a public service. This system, or lack thereof, of street cleaning is a subject of historical debate. Who was actually responsible for cleaning the streets? In theory, a patchwork of parish authorities and private contracts existed. Each householder was technically responsible for cleaning the patch of street directly in front of their property. But in practice, enforcement was lax to non-existent, especially in poorer neighborhoods like yours. Historians argue about the effectiveness of these early, decentralized efforts. Were they a complete failure, or did they represent a nascent, albeit chaotic, form of civic administration? Some argue that the system, for all its flaws, did function at a minimal level, preventing the city from literally burying itself. Others contend it was a total fiction, and the streets were cleaned only by the random scavenging of the destitute and the flushing power of a heavy rainstorm, which was referred to as the scavenger's best friend. You decide to save your halfpenny and take your chances. You wait for a gap in the traffic, a chaotic mix of horse-drawn omnibuses, private carriages, and massive delivery drays, and make a dash for it. You leap over the central kennel, your boots landing with a wet squelch on the other side. A passing omnibus, its huge wheels like charms, sends a spray of brown liquid into the air, and you feel a cold spatter on your trousers and to the side of your face. You don't dare wipe it off. Your hands are probably just as dirty. You just keep moving. Now part of the grimy, shuffling procession. You have learned a vital lesson of London life. Don't look up for falling waste. And don't look down for too long, or you will be swallowed by the crowd. Keep your eyes forward, and keep moving. Your journey through the city has only just begun, and you are already wearing it. As you continue your walk, you become aware of a sensation that has been building since you arrived. A constant, fine grit in your mouth and a slight sting in your nostrils. You look at your hand, which you had braced against a wall for a moment, and see it is covered in a fine black powder. You glance up at the buildings around you. They are not the color of brick or stone, but a uniform, deep, greasy black. This is the omnipresent gift of the Industrial Revolution to London. Soot. The air itself feels thick, something you chew more than breathe. Our main point here is the profound and inescapable nature of coal pollution. The fuel that powered the factories, heated the homes, and ran the steam engines was solid, bituminous coal. When burned, it released vast clouds of thick, black, tarry smoke, with hundreds of thousands of chimneys, from the mighty factory stacks down to the humble hearth in your shared room, all belching this smoke into the atmosphere. The city was trapped under a permanent dome of pollution. This was just an aesthetic problem. It was a physical presence. The soot settled on every surface, creating a universal layer of grime. You watch as a woman tries to hang laundry in a small courtyard. The white sheets are a beacon of hope against the grimy brick, but you know it is a losing battle. Before they are even dry, they will be flecked with black specks. People's faces, especially around the nose and mouth, were often smudged with soot by the end of the day. The famous London fog, romanticized in fiction, was often not a natural water-based fog at all, but a pea souper, a toxic smog created when natural fog mixed with these industrial smoke particles. These fogs could be so thick they would bring the entire city to a standstill, turning midday into a dark, suffocating twilight. People would get lost just a few feet from their own front door. And here is a peculiar, niche detail related to this. The black snow. During winter, it was uncommon for snowfall to be stained black by the soot in the air as it fell. The pristine white blanket you might imagine would, in central London, arrive as a grayish slush or become blackened within hours of landing. Imagine children having a snowball fight with gray, gritty snowballs that left black smudges on their coats and hands. This black snow was a stark, visual representation of the air they were breathing every day. It was just dirty. It was fundamentally altered by the city's industry. This phenomenon leads to an ongoing debate among environmental and architectural historians. How did this constant coating of soot affect the city's architecture and people's perception of it? Some argue that it led to a defensive style of architecture, with smoother, harder surfaces like stucco being favored because they were slightly easier to clean than porous brick or stone. It also might explain the Victorian love for dark, heavy interiors. If the outside world was perpetually gray and black, perhaps a dark, cluttered interior felt comforting and protective, hiding the inevitable dirt that seeped in through every crack. Others argue that people simply became aesthetically blind to it. They ceased to see the blackness, just as they ceased to smell the river. They mentally adjusted their baseline for what a city was supposed to look like. Was Sir Christopher Wren's magnificent street, Paul's Cathedral, its pale Portland stone turned a mottled black, seen as a tragedy? Or was its grimy state simply accepted as the natural appearance of a great, working building in a great, working city? You run your tongue over your teeth and feel the grit. You can taste the industry. This pollution wasn't abstract. It was tactile. It was in your lungs, on your skin, on your food. It was the price of progress, a price paid by every single inhabitant. rich or poor. The rich might have been able to escape to country estates for parts of the year, but when they were in London, they breathed the same air. The shared, democratic filth of the atmosphere was one of the great equalizers. You look around at the monotonous, blackened landscape, a world painted in shades of gray and black. It makes you feel small and anonymous, just another particle in a vast, churning, industrial machine. The grit on your teeth is a constant reminder that the city is not just around you, it is inside you. Hours of walking and navigating the grimy labyrinth have left you thirsty. A deep, primal thirst that demands to be quenched. But now you face one of the most dangerous dilemmas of daily life in Victorian London: where to find safe water. Your first instinct, seeing the mighty Thames flowing nearby, might be to cup your hands and drink. But one look at the brown, debris-strewn water is enough to quell that thought. You remember the smell from the boat, the knowledge that this river is the city's toilet. So, the river is out. What are the other options? You see a group of children gathered around a pump in a small, crowded courtyard. A woman works the handle vigorously, and a stream of water gushes into her wooden bucket. This seems like the answer. This is the main source of water for the vast majority of Londoners, and it is the focus of this chapter. The city's water was supplied by a patchwork of private water companies, who drew their water from various sources, most notably, the very same River Thames you just rejected, or its tributaries. The water was pumped, often unfiltered, into reservoirs and then fed through a network of pipes to communal standpipes like this one. So, while you aren't drinking directly from the sewer river, you are drinking water that was drawn from it just a little further upstream, before the worst of the city's filth was dumped in. It was a marginal improvement. At best, the water that comes out of the pump looks clear enough. But this is where the unseen danger lies. The ground all around this pump, the very soil of London, is saturated with the contents of leaking cesspools. Remember the festering pit beneath your own lodging. Every house has one. The infectious bacteria and viruses from that human waste, especially the cholera vibrio, would seep through the soil and contaminate the groundwater that fed the wells and shallow pumps. The water could look crystal clear, have no discernible smell or taste, and yet be a deadly poison. People had no concept of germ theory. To them, if water looked and tasted fine, it was considered safe. This invisible threat was far more lethal than the visible filth of the streets. This brings us to a strange and specific piece of the water puzzle: the water tasters. Before the age of chemical analysis, some water companies allegedly employed men with refined palates to taste the water and judge its quality. It is a slightly morbid, almost comical image. A man sipping water from a contaminated source and declaring it a fine vintage or a bit earthy today. Of course, this was pure theater and had no scientific basis. A more common and practical test was the laundress's test: how well the water worked with soap. Water that was soft and lathered well was considered good, while hard water that didn't was seen as inferior. This was a test of mineral content, not bacterial contamination. But it was one of the few tangible ways people could judge the quality of the invisible substance they depended on for life. The great historical debate here centers on the water companies themselves. Were they malicious villains, knowingly peddling poison for profit? Or were they simply ignorant businessmen operating within the flawed scientific understanding of their time? The answer is likely somewhere in between. Evidence presented in parliamentary inquiries showed that many companies were aware that their water sources were downstream from major sewer outlets. They knew they were pumping filthy water to their customers. Yet, they fought regulation tooth and nail. arguing that filtration systems were too expensive and that their water was perfectly wholesome. Some historians paint them as the archetypal greedy capitalists, indifferent to the public health crisis they were fueling. Others argue for a more nuanced view, suggesting that while they were certainly negligent, they hadn't grasped the full microbiologic horror of what they were doing. They, like everyone else, were trapped in the pre-germ theory world of miasma, believing that as long as the water didn't stink, it was the primary source of disease. You stand there, parched, watching the queue at the pump. The water looks so tempting, but your 21st century knowledge makes you see it for what it is, a game of Russian roulette. So what do? Many Londoners, perhaps intuitively understanding the risk or simply disliking the taste of the water, opted for a safer alternative: beer. Small beer, or table beer, was a low-alcohol brew that was a staple of the daily diet for men, women, and even children. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water, effectively sterilized it, killing the dangerous microbes. It was hydrating, provided some calories, and was, crucially, safe. Pubs and alehouses were everywhere, and for many, a pint of beer was a healthier choice than a glass of water. You don't have the money for beer right now. Your thirst is overwhelming. You look at the pump, then at the faces of the people drinking the water without a second thought. You take a risk. You cup your hands and take a small, hesitant sip from the communal pump. It is cold and doesn't taste of anything in particular. For a moment, you feel relief. But as you walk away, a new, cold fear begins to settle in your stomach. It is not the filth you can see that will get you here. It is the filth you cannot. Your thirst momentarily quenched. You find yourself drawn by a morbid curiosity back towards the river. You want to understand this monstrous, defining feature of the city. You stand on the Victoria Embankment, or rather, where the Victoria Embankment will be built decades from now. For now, there is no elegant, sweeping stone barrier. There is just a chaotic jumble of rickety wooden piers, muddy banks, and sewer pipes crudely discharging their contents directly onto the forehouse. The tide is out, exposing vast, sloping banks of glistening, black mud that stink in the cool air. This is the raw, untamed edge of the River Thames. The central, horrifying truth you are witnessing is our main historical point. The River Thames was London's all-purpose, open-air sewer. We have touched on this, but seeing it up close is a different experience. It was not just the waste from cesspools that ended up here. In 1815, the flush toilet began to be adopted in the homes of the wealthy. While this seemed like a great leap forward for domestic hygiene, getting the waste out of the house immediately, it had a catastrophic effect on the river. These new toilets were connected to the old sewers, which were originally designed just for rainwater and weren't ever intended to carry solid human waste. They now funneled the filth of the city's most affluent households directly and efficiently into the Thames. So, paradoxically, an invention designed to improve cleanliness made the city's central waterway exponentially more polluted. You watch as a large, iron pipe, emerging from the ground just a few feet away, gushes a steady stream of foul-smelling, brownish liquid onto the mudflats. It carves a channel in the ooze as it flows down to meet the river's current. This is happening all along the riverbanks, on both sides, for miles. The river is not just passively receiving waste. It is being actively, relentlessly fed a diet of it, 24 hours a day. You see things in the mud that your mind tries to reject. The bloated carcass of a dog, tangled rags, rotting vegetable matter, and a thick, greasy scum that coats the surface near the bay. The river, the historic heart of the city and source of its wealth, has been turned into a cloaca. Here is a specific and rather grim detail about the river's state. It was so de-exigent and unpolluted that in the 1850s, it was declared biologically dead for long stretches, particularly in the urban core. There were no fish. Nothing could survive in the toxic soup. However, strange new life forms did thrive. Immense colonies of bacteria. Scientists in the 1850s, studying the river water under microscopes, were horrified to find it swarming with what they called vibrionic animalcules, the cholera bacteria. One scientist, Arthur Hassel, famously described the water as a viscid, soupy, and brownish-colored fluid, charged with animal and vegetable productions, dead and living. He noted that a single drop of Thames water under the microscope looked like a bustling, monstrous universe of its own. This leads to a fascinating historical debate. Did people fully comprehend what they had done to their river? On one hand, the evidence was overwhelming. The smell, the sight, the dead fish. It was impossible to ignore. Newspapers and social reformers like Charles Dickens wrote scathing articles about the state of the Thames, calling it a national disgrace. Yet, on the other hand, there was a profound sense of inertia and helplessness. Who was responsible for a river? The private water companies, the myriad of local parish councils, Parliament. The sheer scale of the problem seemed to paralyze everyone. Historians argue whether this was a failure of political will, a failure of engineering imagination, or a deeper psychological failure to take responsibility for collective environmental destruction. Was the river seen as a living entity that had been murdered, or was it viewed simply as a convenient, God-given feature of the landscape, a tool to be used and exploited, with its foulness being an unfortunate but unavoidable side effect of progress? You watch the slow, brown current swirl and eddy. The river is not just a sewer. It is a mirror, reflecting the city's contradictions. It brought immense wealth through trade, yet it harbored disease. It was a source of poetic inspiration for centuries, yet now it was a source of stench and horror. It was the city's lifeblood and its septic tank. All at once, standing here, on these foul-smelling mudflats, you understand that you cannot comprehend 19th century London without comprehending this profound, abusive relationship it had with its own river. The problems you have seen so far, the cesspools, the street filth, the contaminated wells, are all symptoms. The river is the heart of the disease, and you get a chilling premonition that sooner or later, this abused, overburdened river is going to fight back. Back in your shared room, the man named Arthur is coughing. It is a deep, wrecking cough that speaks of more than just a common cold. His wife, who lives in the same building, comes in to check on him. She looks at his pale, sweaty face with worry and says, "It is the air. The smell from the privy in the yard must have got to him. A bad miasma." She lights a small piece of rag dipped in vinegar, hoping the sharp smell will purify the air in the tiny room. Her diagnosis and her remedy are a perfect illustration of the dominant medical theory of your time, which is our central topic for this section, the miasma theory. For most of the 19th century, the educated and the uneducated alike believed that many diseases, particularly epidemic ones like cholera, typhus, and the plague, were caused by miasma, from the Greek word for pollution. This was, quite literally, bad air. The theory held that diseases were transmitted by the foul-smelling vapors that rose from decaying organic matter, rotting corpses, sewage, garbage, and stagnant water. In this worldview, The smell was a disease. If you could smell a sewer, you were inhaling the thing that would make you sick. This is why your landlady isn't blaming a contaminated drink or a specific contact. She is blaming the ambient, foul odor of the neighborhood. This theory made a certain kind of intuitive sense. The poorest, smelly street parts of the city were, in fact, the most disease-ridden. The connection was clear. The mistake was in the causation. They saw a correlation between bad smells and sickness and assumed the smell was the cause, rather than seeing both the smell and the sickness as the results of a common underlying problem, a lack of sanitation in the presence of invisible germs. This belief shaped all public health efforts. The focus was on eliminating odors. People would carry handkerchiefs scented with perfume or vinegar to press to their noses in foul-smelling areas. Homes were fumigated by burning aromatic woods or chemicals. City planners advocated for wider streets and more parks, not just for aesthetics, but with the specific goal of allowing fresh air to circulate and blow the miasma away. And here is a quirky, specific detail that grew out of this theory: the use of smelling bottles or vinaigrette. These were small, ornate containers, often made of silver or glass, with a pierced lid. Inside was a sponge soaked in aromatic vinegar or ammonia. A well-to-do lady, feeling faint or being assailed by a particularly noxious street smell, would elegantly lift her smelling bottle to her nose and take a deep sniff. It was the portable, upper-class version of burning a vinegar-soaked rag. It was both a fashion accessory and a personal anti-miasma device, a tiny fortress against the invisible, foul-smelling enemies lurking in the city air. The miasma theory is a fascinating subject of historical debate, particularly concerning how it both helped and hindered medical progress. On the one hand, it was a major step forward from blaming disease on divine punishment or an imbalance of the four humors. It correctly identified the environment as a key factor in public health. This focus on the environment led to what was called the sanitary movement, which advocated for cleaning up cities, improving housing, and providing clean water. All things that, coincidentally, did reduce disease, just not for the reasons they thought. The miasmatists were essentially right for the wrong reasons. Cleaning up the filth to get rid of the smell also happened to get rid of the germs. On the other hand, the theory was a powerful obstacle to the acceptance of germ theory. When early pioneers like John Snow, who we will meet soon, suggested that cholera was a waterborne disease caused by an invisible agent, they were often ridiculed by the medical establishment. How could a tasteless, odorless glass of water be more dangerous than the putrid, stinking air of a slum? The miasma theory was so entrenched, so intuitively appealing, that it blinded a whole generation of doctors and scientists to the evidence right in front of them. The debate among historians is how to weigh these two legacies. Was miasma theory necessary? Is fraud, stepping stone on the path to modern public health? Or was it a dogmatic dead, and that cost thousands of lives by delaying the discovery and acceptance of the truth? You watch Arthur's wife fussing around him, her faith in the purifying power of vinegar absolute. Her actions are born of love and the best scientific knowledge available to her. But you know, with your privileged foresight, that her efforts are tragically misplaced. The enemy isn't in the air, they are breathing. At least not in the way she thinks. It is silent and invisible, lurking in the communal water top, on unwashed hands, or in contaminated food. Her belief in miasma gives her a sense of control, a way to fight that. But it is a phantom enemy, and while she is busy fighting smells, the real killer remains unseen and undefeated. The days turn into a week, and the rhythm of the city becomes your own. The grime, the noise, the smells, they don't disappear. but they become a constant, the background hum of your existence. Then, one hot August afternoon, a new element is introduced: fear. It starts as a rumor, whispered in the queues for water and in the alehouses. Have you heard about the folks down in Soho? The blue sickness is back. They are talking about cholera. It is a name that strikes a special kind of terror in the hearts of Londoners, far more than the routine dangers of typhus or consumption. Cholera is different. It is swift. It is violent. And it is terrifyingly democratic. This is our main focus. The experience of a cholera outbreak in a city completely unprepared for. Cholera had swept through London in waves before, in 1832 and 1848, leaving tens of thousands dead. Its return is like the news of an invading army. The disease, caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, is brutal in its efficiency. It attacks the intestines, causing catastrophic diarrhea and vomiting that can dehydrate a perfectly healthy person to the point of death in less than a day. Its victims were often left with a bluish-gray pallor to their skin due to severe dehydration, which is why it was sometimes called the Blue Death. The fear spreads faster than the disease itself. You see it in people's eyes. Neighbors who used to nod to now eye each other with suspicion. A cough in the street makes people flinch and cross to the other side. The community, already strained, begins to fracture under the pressure. People start to flee the city, if they have the means, carrying the disease with them to the surrounding countryside. For those like you, who are trapped, there's a feeling of utter helplessness. The official response is slow and confused, guided by the flawed asthma theory. The Board of Health issues proclamations urging citizens to avoid putrid fogs and to burn bonfires in the streets to purify the air. Huge barrels of tar are set ablaze, filling the already smoky air with an even more acrid stench. A desperate, aromatic assault against an invisible enemy. Here is a specific, chilling detail about the chaos of a cholera epidemic. The cholera carts. As the death toll mounts, the normal rituals of death and burial break down. There is no time for individual coffins or proper funerals. Instead, municipal carts are sent around the city, accompanied by the grim cry of "Bring out your dead." Bodies, often wrapped only in a simple sheet, would be collected from homes and piled onto the cart to be taken to mass graves, or plague pits, dug on the outskirts of the city. The speed of the disease was such that sometimes people who were merely unconscious from dehydration were mistaken for dead and loaded onto the carts. There are terrifying accounts of people waking up amongst a pile of corpses. This breakdown of the most basic human decencies was, for many, the most traumatic part of the epidemic. The historical debates surrounding these outbreaks is intense, particularly regarding their social and political consequences. Did the cholera epidemics act as a catalyst for social change, or did they simply reinforce existing prejudices? Some historians argue that cholera was a great, if brutal, equalizer. It struck down the rich and poor alike, though the poor always suffered more, forcing the ruling classes to acknowledge that the squalor of the slums was a threat to the entire city. This fear, the argument goes, was the primary driver behind the sanitary reforms that would eventually follow. Cholera scared the government into action in a way that decades of moral pleading by reformers never could. Other historians argue that the outbreaks primarily deepened social divisions. The wealthy and the press often blamed the victims, attributing the disease to the intemperate and immoral lifestyles of the poor. They saw it as a consequence of drunkenness, laziness, and uncleanliness, a form of divine or natural punishment for their perceived moral failings. This narrative allowed the wealthy to distance themselves from the problem, seeing it as a moral issue rather than an environmental one that they themselves contributed to through their inaction and exploitation. So, Was cholera a wake-up call that united the city against a common foe, or a convenient excuse to blame the most vulnerable for their own suffering? The truth, as always, is likely a complex mix of both. You walk through your neighborhood that evening, and the air is thick with the smoke from a cleansing bonfire. The mood is grim and quiet. The usual boisterous noise of the street is replaced by a hushed tension. You see a door marked with a crude white cross, a sign that cholera is inside. You hurry past, pulling your coat tighter, holding your breath, as if you could physically block out the encroaching plague. The fear is palpable. It is a fear born of incompression errand. Your neighbor is healthy at breakfast and dead by sundown, and no one can tell you why for sure. It is not a battle. It is a lottery, and all you can do is wait, and hope your number isn't called. The cholera outbreak in Soho is getting worse. The death toll is climbing at an alarming rate, concentrated in a terrifyingly small area, while most of the city is paralyzed by fear or busy burning tar barrels. You notice a strange figure in the neighborhood. He is a quiet, respectable-looking man in his early 40s, but he is doing something unusual. He is not looking up at the sky for miasmas. He is going from house to house, knocking on doors, and asking the same strange questions. Where do you get your water? Which pump do you use? This man is dry. Jon Snow. And you are about to witness a pivotal moment in the history of public health. Our focus here is on Jon Snow and his revolutionary, data-driven investigation into the Soho cholera outbreak of 1854. Snow, an anesthetist who had even administered chloroform to Queen Victoria, had a radical, unpopular idea. He didn't believe in the miasma theory. Years earlier, he had published a paper arguing that cholera was not an airborne disease, but was spread through contaminated water that was ingested. The medical establishment largely ignored or mocked him. Now, with the outbreak raging in his own neighborhood, he has a chance to prove his theory. You watch him work. He is methodical, almost obsessive. He talks to the families of the victims, patiently recording details. He is not just a doctor, he is a detective. His central piece of evidence becomes a map, a street plan of Soho, for every person who has died from cholera. He makes a small black mark at their address. As he adds more and more marks, a terrifying pattern begins to emerge. The deaths are not randomly distributed. They are clustered, thick and undeniable, around one particular public water pump on Broad Street, now Broadwick Street. The further a house is from that pump, the fewer the deaths. He discovers that workers at a nearby brewery, who drank beer instead of water, were almost entirely spared. He finds a workhouse with its own private well that had very few cases, even though it was surrounded by death. One story, a strange little detail that becomes a key piece of his evidence, is that of the distant victim. Snow investigates the death of a widow who had lived in Hampstead, several miles away from Soho, and had not been in the area for a long time. This case seems to disprove his theory, but Snow is relentless. He interviews her son and makes a startling discovery. The widow had grown up in Soho and had retained a fondness for the taste of the water from the Broad Street pump. She had a servant send a large bottle of it to her in Hampstead every single day. She drank the water, and she died. Her visiting niece also took a sip, and she too became ill. This was the smoking gun, a direct causal link between the pump water and the disease, independent of the Soho air. This leads to a historical debate that persists to this day. How much credit does Jon Snow truly deserve for defeating the Soho outbreak? The popular story, the one often told, is a dramatic one. Snow, armed with his mat, goes before the local board of guardians with the force of his evidence, convinces them to take the handle off the Broad Street pump. The handle is removed. People stop drinking the water, and the outbreak magically subsides. It is a beautiful, heroic narrative of science triumphing over ignorance. However, many historians argue for a more nuanced reality. By the time Snow presented his findings and the pump handle was removed on September 8, 1854, the outbreak was already waning. The reason for this is grimly simple. The cholera had already killed most of the susceptible people in the immediate vicinity, and many others had fled the neighborhood. Removing the handle was a crucial symbolic act, and it certainly prevented the outbreak from flaring up again. But it may not have been the dramatic, single-handed victory it is often portrayed as. The debate isn't about diminishing Snow's genius. His epidemiological method was revolutionary and laid the foundation for modern public health investigations. The debate is about how quickly his ideas were accepted and how directly his actions stopped that specific outbreak. Was he a lone hero who saved the day, or a brilliant cause Indra whose true vindication would only come years later? You see Snow standing by the now infamous pump, his map in hand, looking at the cluster of black marks that represent so much human tragedy. He doesn't look triumphant. He looks tired, but certain. The people around him still eye him with suspicion. This strange doctor with his peculiar obsession with water. They don't know it, but they are witnessing a paradigm shift. The miasma theory, that great, shadowy beast, has just received a mortal wound, delivered not by a grand proclamation, but by a quiet man with a simple map, who had the courage to look down at the water instead of up at the air. The pump handle will soon be gone, but the ghost of the miasma will haunt London for years to come. The cholera scare, for now, has subsided, but life along the river returns to its grim normalcy. As the tide recedes, it reveals the glistening, foul-smelling mudflats once more, and with them, a peculiar form of human activity. You see them from a distance. Small figures, mostly children and the elderly, hunched over, moving slowly through the black ooze. They carry sacks or baskets and poke at the mud with sticks or their bare hands. These are the mudlarks, and their desperate, squalid form of scavenging is our focus for this chapter. Being a mudlark was one of the lowest strungs on the ladder of London's informal economy. It was a job born of pure desperation. When the tide went out, these individuals would descend onto the forehour of the Thames to sift through the mud and sewage for anything of value that might have been washed ashore or dumped in the river. It was a treasure hunt in the city as toilet. Their potential findings were meager. Scraps of coal that had fallen from barges, bits of old rope, fragments of metal, lost coins, or perhaps a piece of driftwood. It was a backbreaking, filthy, and incredibly dangerous job. You watch a young boy, no older than 10, his trousers rolled up to his knees, his legs and arms coated in the black, greasy mud. He works with intense concentration, his eyes scanning the ground. His fingers, round red from the cold and the constant wetness, probe into the slime. The mud itself was a toxic cocktail. It was thick with human and animal waste, industrial effluent, and the bacteria of diseases like typhoid and cholera. Every cut or scrape, a common occurrence from sharp metal or broken glass hidden in the ooze, was a potential death sentence from infection. The smell is overpowering, a concentrated version of the river's usual stench. Yet the mudlarks work on, seemingly oblivious. They had to be. Their next meal depended on it. This brings us to a specific, and rather poignant, little-known aspect of their trade, the hierarchy of found objects. While coal and scrap metal were the bread and butter, the holy grail for a mudlark was finding a corpse, not a human one, which was a common and gruesome find, but of no value. But the carcass of a dog. This is a grim detail, but it is true. There was a market for dead dogs. Their skins could be sold to tanners for a few pence. A significant sum for a mudlark. The most famous documenter of London's poor, Henry Mayhew, interviewed mudlarkess who spoke of the competition to find and claim a dead dog, sometimes even getting into fights over a particularly well-preserved carcass. It is a haunting illustration of the desperate calculus of poverty, where the dead pets of the city became a source of income for its most destitute children. The historical debate surrounding the mudlarkess centers on how they were perceived by the rest of Victorian society. Were they seen as pitiable victims of circumstance, or as a public nuisance and a moral stain? On one hand, writers like Mayhew, to some extent, Dickens, portrayed them with a degree of sympathy, highlighting their wretched conditions and incredible resilience. They were presented as the tragic but inevitable byproduct of a society that produced so much wealth and so much waste in equal measure. These accounts helped to awaken the conscience of the middle class to the reality of urban poverty. On the other hand, too many Londoners into the authorities. The mudlarkess were simply part of the riverbank's filth. They were seen as dirty, feral, and prone to criminality. They were often chased away by dock workers or police. They were viewed not as individuals scavenging to survive, but as an undifferentiated mass, a symbol of social decay. This debate questions whether the Victorian gaze on poverty was ever truly compassionate, or if it was always filtered through a lens of moral judgment and fear. Did looking at a mudlark inspire a desire for social reform, or simply a desire to look away and get the problem out of sight? You watch the boy find something. He plunges his hand deep into the mud and pulls out a dark, twisted piece of metal. He examines it for a moment, then drops it into his sack with a small, metallic click. It is a tiny victory, perhaps worth a fraction of a penny. He moves on, his back bent, his eyes fixed on the ground. The rising tide will soon cover these flats again, washing away his footprints, hiding the filth until the next low tide. But for the mudlarkess, the cycle will continue. They are a part of the river's ecosystem, human decomposers living off the city's decay. They are a stark, physical embodiment of a society that discards not only its waste, but also its people, onto the foul-smelling margins. One day, you find a small piece of work as a porter, carrying a wealthy gentleman's trunk from his carriage to a townhouse in one of the grand squares of the West End. This is your chance to see the other side, to glimpse how the people of quality live. The contrast is immediate and jarring. The streets here are wider, cleaner, and quieter. The suffocating press of the crowd is gone. The houses are magnificent, faced with pale stucco or Portland stone, though even here, you can see a faint grayish film of soot clinging to the grand porticos. A street sweeper, not a desperate, freelance child, but a uniformed municipal worker, is methodically cleaning the cobblestones. The air still has the taste of coal, but the more visceral stenches of raw sewage and dense humanity are blessedly absent. You follow the gentleman into his house, and this is where we focus on our main point. The hygiene of the wealthy was often more of an aesthetic performance than a truly sanitary reality. Inside, the house is a temple of curated order. The floors are polished, the furniture is dusted, and the air is thick with the scent of beeswax and potpourri. It is a carefully constructed fortress against the filth of the outside world. The family has access to things you can only dream of: a water closet, a flush toilet that whisks waste away out of sight, and a dedicated washed stand in each bedroom with a large pitcher and basin, filled with water that is, presumably, cleaner than the water from your communal pump. But as you look closer, you start to see the cracks in this facade of cleanliness. The lady of the house, who comes to inspect the trunk's placement, is exquisitely dressed, but she is also wearing a powerful French perfume. It is a beautiful scent, but its purpose is not just to be pleasant. It is to mask. It is a chemical shield against any lingering, unpleasant body odors. Bathing, even for the rich, was not the daily ritual it is today. A full immersion bath in hot water was a complex operation. Water had to be hauled up from the kitchen, heated over the fire, and poured into a portable tub placed in front of a fireplace. It was an event, undertaken perhaps once a week, or even less frequently. In between, they made do with the same kind of sponge baths from a basin as the poor, albeit with more water, more soap, and more privacy. This brings us to a specific, and slightly comical, detail of upper-class hygiene: the toilet mask. Some Victorian ladies, concerned about the effects of the smoggy air gas lighting on their complexion, would sleep wearing a mask made of cloth or even thin leather. These masks were often lined with silk and smeared on the inside with creams or balms made of wax, spermaceti, or other concoctions. The idea was to protect the skin from the bad air overnight and to keep the balms in place to nourish the complexion. Imagine a wealthy woman in her luxurious four-poster bed, her face covered by one of these strange, slightly sinister-looking masks. It was a beauty ritual born directly out of the polluted environment they lived in, a desperate attempt to preserve a pale, delicate complexion against the city's constant assault. The historical debate here revolves around the true effectiveness of these upper-class hygiene practices. Did their wealth actually protect them from disease? Or did it just provide a false sense of security? On one hand, their access to slightly cleaner water sources, some private wells or less polluted water company supplies, better food, and less crowded living conditions undoubtedly gave them a huge advantage. They were less likely to contract diseases like typhus, which thrived in overcrowded conditions. However, historians argue that their ignorance of germ theory could often negate these advantages. The flushed toilet, for example, was a perfect case of out of sight, out of mind. It brilliantly removed the filth from the house. But as we know, it simply channeled it more efficiently into the river, poisoning the water supply for everyone else and sometimes even for themselves, as some wealthy estates drew their water from the Thames downstream of their own sewer outlets. Furthermore, their houses were oft unheavily draped and curtained, with windows kept shut to keep out the certain miasma, leading to poor ventilation that could allow airborne diseases like tuberculosis to thrive. So, were they truly healthier, or just better at hiding the dirt? The argument is that their cleanliness was a carefully managed illusion, focused on visible dirt and bad smells, while the true microbial threats often went completely unaddressed. You place the trunk down, receive a small coin for your trouble, and are quickly ushered out the servant's entrance, stepping back into the street. The contrast is dizzying. You have just left a world that smells of flowers and wax and return to one that smells of horses and humanity. But you have seen behind the curtain. The wealth of the West End can build taller walls, but it cannot completely keep the city at bay. Their hygiene is a constant, laborious battle, fought with perfume, masks, and a healthy dose of self-deception. They may have been living a 5-star version of the same filthy existence, but they were still breathing the same air. You have been wearing the same set of clothes for weeks now. The grime is no longer a surface layer. It feels woven into the very fabric. Your shirt is stiff. Your trousers smell of everything you have brushed up against, and the lice are your constant. Kitchen companions, it is time for a wash. But in 19th century London, for someone like you, this isn't a simple matter of tossing things into a machine. Laundry day is an epic, all-day struggle, a battle against filth that requires immense physical labor and resources. This arduous process is our focus for the vast majority of people who couldn't afford to pay a washerman. Laundry was done by hand. At home, you watch a woman in your tenement prepare for this Herculean task. Her name is Mary, and she is the wife of your roommate, Arthur. The process begins the night before, when she soaks the most heavily soiled items in a wooden tub filled with cold water and perhaps some lye, a harsh alkaline substance made from wood ash, to loosen the dirt. The next morning, the real work begins. First, she needs vast quantities of water. This means multiple trips up and down the stairs, hauling heavy buckets from the communal pump. Then, the water needs to be heated. This is the biggest hurdle. It requires a huge amount of coal or wood. A significant expense. The water is heated in a copper, a large metal cauldron built into the corner of the kitchen or scullery fireplace. The entire room fills with steam and the smell of boiling, dirty linen. Mary uses a large wooden stick to agitate the clothes in the scalding water. She then transfers the sodden, heavy garments to a washtub, where she scrubs them by hand against a washboard, a ribbed panel of wood or metal. Her knuckles are red and dry. Her back is bent. The sheer physical strength required is immense. This process might be repeated with fresh, hot water for heavily soiled items. After scrubbing, the clothes must be rinsed, again, requiring more buckets of clean water. Then comes the wringing. She twists each item by hand, squeezing out as much water as possible, her arm and shoulder muscles straining. Finally, the clothes are hung up to dry. In a cramped tenement, this often means stringing lines across the small room, plunging the living space into a damp, shadowy forest of wet laundry that can take days to dry. Especially in the damp London climate, the whole process, from start to finish, can take an entire day, or even two. It is exhausting, expensive, and disruptive. Now you understand why clothes were washed so infrequently. It was just laziness. It was a major domestic undertaking. Here is a specific, quirky detail about laundry day: the use of bluing. After washing and rinsing, white fabrics would often be given a final rinse in water, to which a small amount of laundry blue, a powder or cube of synthetic ultramarine or indigo, had been added. This didn't actually make the clothes cleaner, but it added a faint blue tint that counteracted the natural yellowing of the fabric, making the whites appear brighter and whiter to the eye. It was a purely optical trick, a chemical illusion of cleanliness that was a point of pride for any self-respecting housewife. Getting the blue just right was a skill. Too little had no effect. Too much would leave the laundry streaked with blue. The historical debate here centers on the social and economic role of washerwomen, or laundresses. These were the women who, for a fee, would take in the laundry of the middle and upper classes. On one hand, this was one of the few respectable occupations available to working-class women, especially widows or those with unreliable husbands. It allowed them to earn an income from their own homes. The image of the hardy, independent washerwoman became a kind of working-class archetype. On the other hand, historians argue that it was one of the most grueling and exploited forms of labor. Washerwomen worked incredibly long hours in hot, steamy, and hazardous conditions for very low pay. The stereotype of the washerwoman often included a reputation for heavy drinking. Gin was sometimes called washerwoman's comfort, as a way to cope with the brutal physical demands of the job. So, was the laundress an icon of female working class independence, or a symbol of the punishing, back-breaking labor that was the reality for so many women? The debate exposes the complex intersection of gender, class, and labor in the Victorian city. You look at Mary, her face flushed from the steam, her arms deep in soapy water, and you feel a new respect for the simple, clean shirt worn by a clerk or the crisp white apron of a shop girl. You now know the sheer human effort embodied in that small patch of cleanliness. It was to given. It was a hard-won victory against the city's pervasive grime, a victory achieved through aching backs and raw hands in a steam-filled room. Your own clothes remain dirty. You don't have the time, the money for fuel, or the energy for such a battle. For now, you will continue to wear the city on your back. A dull ache in your back molar that started a few days ago has now blossomed into a sharp, throbbing, relentless pain. It is a pain that eclipses all other miseries. The hunger, the grime, the fatigue. You cannot eat. You cannot sleep. And you certainly cannot work. You need to have the tooth dealt with. But in mid-19th century London, there are no sterile, white-walled dental clinics with reclining chairs and gentle hygienists. Your options are grim, and they form the painful focus of this chapter, the brutal reality of dental care. For the vast majority of the population, dental hygiene was virtually non-existent. Sugar, once a luxury, had become cheap and plentiful thanks to colonial plantations, leading to a massive increase in tooth decay. Toothbrushes existed, but they were a middle-class affectation. For most, cleaning your teeth might involve rubbing them with a rough cloth and some salt or soot, if you did anything at all. As a result, rotten teeth and abscesses were a common, painful part of life. When a tooth became unbearable, the only solution was extraction. So, where do you go? You don't go to a dentist in the modern sense. That profession is still in its infancy, catering only to the very wealthy. Your first and most common option is the barber surgeon. Barbers had, for centuries, performed minor surgical procedures like bloodletting, lancing boils, and pulling teeth, alongside cutting hair. You find one in a busy market street, his shop marked by the iconic reddened, white-striped pole, representing bloody bandages. The operating theater is the same chair where a man just had a shave. The tools are laid out on a tray, a terrifying collection of metal pliers and levers, like the tooth key, a clawed instrument that was inserted into the mouth, hooked around the tooth, and then twisted to break it from the jaw. There is no anesthetic, maybe a swig of gin or whiskey beforehand to steady the nerves. But that is it. Your second option might be a blacksmith. Their strength and familiarity with tongs and pliers made them a natural, if terrifying, choice for tooth pulling in many communities. Their methods were even more direct and forceful. Or, you could seek out an itinerant tooth drawer at a local fair. These were showmen who would set up a small stage, often with a drummer or a trumpeter to drown out the screams of the patient, and would pull teeth with great theatrical flair to attract a crowd. It was part public service, part grotesque entertainment. This brings us to a specific, and frankly horrifying, detail: Waterloo teeth. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, a new and gruesome trade emerged. Scavengers, including opportunistic dentists and their agents, descended on the battlefield to pull the teeth from the jaws of the tens of thousands of dead young soldiers. These healthy, strong teeth were then boiled, shaped, and set into ivory or hippopotamus bone bases to create high-quality dentures for the wealthy elite in London and Paris. For decades, a fine set of dentures was often referred to as Waterloo teeth. So, A wealthy aristocrat smiling at a ball might be showcasing the teeth of a soldier who fell in Belgium. It was the ultimate, macabre form of recycling. The historical debate here concerns the professionalization of dentistry. When did the shift from the brutal tooth drawer to the trained dental surgeon actually happen? And what drove it? Some historians argue that the change was driven by scientific and technological advancements, the development of effective anesthesia, like ether and nitrous oxide, in the late 1840s, and a better understanding of dental anatomy. These advancements allowed for more complex procedures and necessitated a higher level of skill, pushing the trade towards a profession. Other historians argue that the primary driver was social class. The burgeoning middle class wanted to distinguish themselves from the working class. They didn't want to go to the same barber or blacksmith as their servants. They demanded a more respectable and less public form of treatment. This created a market for a new kind of practitioner, the educated, professional dentist, who operated in a private parlor rather than a public shop. In this view, the rise of modern dentistry was as much about social aspiration and the performance of respectability as it was about medical progress. Was it science that killed the tooth drawer? Or was it snobbery? You stand outside the barber-surgeon's shop, listening to a muffled groan from within. The pain in your jaw is excruciating. Your heart, sharp poke, but the start of that cold, unsterilized metal in your mouth, the sound of the root cracking, the blinding, white-hot pain of the extraction. It is almost worse. You weigh two kinds of agony. For now, you clutch your jaw and walk away. You will endure the throbbing a little longer. Like so many others, you are trapped between the disease and the cure, and it is hard to say which is worse. The story of your time in London, and the story of London's filth, is now approaching its dramatic, sweltering climax. We are moving forward to a specific and infamous point in time, the summer of 1858. The year starts normally enough, but as spring gives way to summer, something unusual happens. It gets hot, not just warm, but relentlessly, oppressively hot. A prolonged heat wave, combined with a lack of rain, settles over the city like a suffocating blanket. Day after day, the sun beats down from a hazy, cloudless sky, baking the soot-blackened bricks of the tenements, unturning the narrow, airless streets into ovens. This intense, inescapable heat is the central feature of this chapter. For you, living in your cramped, poorly ventilated room, it is a special kind of misery. The heat radiates from the roof and walls all night, making sleep impossible. The air is thick and stagnant. The entire city seems to slow down, to move with a lethargic. Heat days languor. Tempers are short. The usual cacophony of the streets is muted, replaced by a low, weary hum. But the heat is doing more than just making people uncomfortable. It is acting as a catalyst. It is taking all the elements of filth we have experienced so far, the cesspools, the street waste, the polluted river, and it is cooking them. The heat accelerates the process of decay. The mountains of horse manure in the streets, the household garbage piled in courtyards, the offal from the butcher shops, all of it begins to put FY at an alarming rate under the relentless sun. The smells, always a feature of London life, are intensified, rising in thick, almost visible waves of stench. The city, which always smelled bad, now smells unimaginably foul. It is as if a monstrous, invisible beast has breathed its carrion breath over every street and alley. People walk around with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, not out of polite affectation, but out of sheer, desperate necessity. And here is a specific sensory detail about the effect of the heat. The flies. The combination of heat and abundant, rotting matter creates the perfect breeding ground for flies. The city is swarmed by them. They are everywhere. A buzzing, crawling, maddening plague. They settle in black, shifting masses on piles of garbage. They swarm in clouds around the entrances to butcher shops and food stalls. They get into your room, your food, your drink. You are constantly waving them away from your face. This plague of flies adds a new layer of torment to the heat and the smell, a constant, irritating reminder of the decay that surrounds you. It feels biblical, apocalyptic. This leads to a historical debate among environmental historians. Was the summer of 1858 a truly anomalous event? Or was it simply the inevitable culmination of decades of neglect? Some argue that it was a perfect storm, a freak weather event that, by pure chance, exposed the city's underlying sanitation crisis in a uniquely dramatic way. Without the prolonged, intense heat wave, the situation might have continued to be merely terrible for years to come, without ever reaching a crisis point that forced action. In this view, London was simply unlucky. Other historians argue that a crisis of this nature was absolutely inevitable and that the heat wave was merely the trigger, not the fundamental cause. The city had been dumping its waste into the river and ignoring its sanitation problems for half a century. The system was at a breaking point. If it hadn't been the heat wave of 1858, it would have been a particularly bad cholera outbreak, or a flood, or some other event that would have exposed the catastrophic failure of the city's infrastructure. They argue that seeing it as a freak event lets the authorities off the hook. It was bad luck. It was the predictable result of a colossal, long-term failure of governance and civic responsibility. Was it an act of God, or a bill for decades of environmental abuse finally coming due? You lie on your straw mattress, sweating in the suffocating heat of your room. The window is open, but it offers no relief, only letting in the thick, foul air from outside and the incessant buzzing of flies. The city feels sick, feverish, and you realize that the intensified smells from the streets and the courtyards are still just the opening act, the main event. The true horror that this heat is about to unleash will come from the city's dark, septic heart, the River Thames. The stage is set. The heat is the spark, and the river is the powder keg. The heat wave continues. And now the main event begins. The focus of all of London's misery, the source of the coming crisis, is the river, with no significant rainfall. The flow of the Thames has slowed to a sluggish crawl. The water level is exceptionally low. This means that the millions of gallons of raw sewage being pumped into it every day are not being washed out to sea. They are lingering, stewing, concentrating, and under the relentless, baking sun, the river begins to ferment. This is it. This is the beginning of the historical event known as the Great Stink. Our narrative now plunges into the sensory horror of this phenomenon. The river ceases to be a body of water and becomes a vast, open sewer, cooking under the summer sun. The smell that rises from it is unlike anything you have ever experienced. It is not just the smell of sewage. It is the smell of sewage that has been heated, that has undergone a monstrous chemical transformation. It is a thick, complex, and overpowering stench that defies simple description. It has the rotten egg smell of hydrogen sulfide, the sharp tang of ammonia, and the deep, fecal notes of indolent scotoa, all mixed into one gag, inducing miasma. It is described by contemporary sources as a pestilential smell, an intolerable effluvium. The stink is not confined to the riverbanks. It is a physical presence that invades the entire city. It rolls in off the river, impalpable, nauseating waves. It seeps through closed doors and windows. It permeates stone walls. There is no escape. Whether you are in your poor tenement in the East End or in a grand house in Belgravia, you can smell it. The whole of London, a city of over 2 million people, is held hostage by the stench of its own filth. Life is reoriented around this smell. People try to block it out, stuffing rags in the cracks around their windows, burning lavender and tobacco. But nothing works. The great stink is absolute. Here is a particularly vivid and slightly disgusting detail from the time. The river's appearance. As the sewage fermented, bubbles of methane and other gases would constantly rise to the surface and pop, releasing fresh waves of stench. The water itself was so thick, with suspended solids, that it was described as looking like a black, viscous fluid. One scientist, Michael Faraday, conducted a famous experiment where he dropped pieces of white paper into the river from a boat. He reported that the paper disappeared from sight before it had sunk, even an inch below the surface. The river had become an opaque slurry, a living, bubbling, putrefied entity. It was as if the city had a monstrous, septic wound running through its heart, and that wound was now festering for all to see and smell. The historical debate around the great stink centers on its psychological impact. Was the primary emotion fear or anger? On one hand, given the prevailing miasma theory, the stench was terrifying to the people of London. This was just an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of death. They believed they were breathing in the very essence of cholera and typhoid on an unprecedented scale. The newspapers were filled with apocalyptic predictions of a coming plague that would wipe out the city. This created a climate of genuine panic. People who had the means to leave the city did so in droves. On the other hand, many historians argue that the dominant emotion was a profound, city-wide anger and humiliation. The great stink was an unavoidable, democratic insult. It didn't matter how wealthy you were. The smell invaded your home just as it did the poorest slum. It was a national embarrassment. The world's richest and most powerful city was literally choking on its own excrement. This humiliation, this collective sense of we cannot go on like this, is what many historians believe was the true catalyst for change. The problem was no longer hidden in the slums or confined to academic reports. It was an assault on the nostrils of the most powerful people in the country. Was it the fear of disease that finally forced action? Or was it the unbearable shame of living in a city that smelled like a toilet? You try to go about your day, but the smell is a constant companion, a suffocating blanket. It makes your eyes water and your stomach churn. Food has no taste. Or rather, everything tastes faintly of the river. At night, you try to sleep, but the foul air wafts through your window, thick and heavy. The great stink is not just a smell. It is an experience. It is the culmination of every bad decision, every shortcut, every bit of neglect. It is the city's repressed filth rising from its watery grave to haunt its creators, and its most important victims, the ones who would finally be forced to act, were just up the river, in the Houses of Parliament. The great stink continues its assault, but now its focus narrows to a very specific and very important target, the Palace of Westminster, home to the Houses of Parliament. The grand, Gothic Revival building, a symbol of British power and prestige, sits right on the northern bank of the River Thames. This prime location, once a source of scenic beauty, has now become its greatest vulnerability. The very men who had the power to fix the problem were now, quite literally, on the front line of the stench. This confrontation between the politicians and the putrefaction is our central scene. The lawmakers of the most powerful empire on earth found themselves under siege by an enemy they could not debate, legislate against, or ignore. The smell rolling off the fermenting river was so intense that it infiltrated the hallowed halls of Parliament. Business in the committee rooms, which directly overlooked the Thames, became almost impossible. The magnificent library, a place of quiet contemplation, was rendered unusable. Members of Parliament, lords and commoners alike, were seen running through the corridors holding handkerchiefs soaked in chloride of lime to their faces. The situation went from being a public health issue out there to being an immediate, personal, and nauseating crisis in here. The government's initial attempts to solve the problem were comically ineffective and a perfect illustration of their desperation. They ordered that the curtains on the river-facing side of the building be soaked in a solution of chloride of lime, a disinfectant and deodorizer. The idea was that the cloth would act as a filter, purifying the air that entered the building. This is our specific, slightly absurd detail. The image of the grand drapes of the British Parliament, dripping with disinfectant, a flimsy, aromatic shield against a tidal wave of stench. Of course, it did almost nothing. The smell was too powerful. It was a classic case of treating the symptom, not the cause. Fighting a miasma with another, slightly more medicinal, miasma. The situation inside the chamber of the House of Commons became a dark farce. The leader of the House, Benjamin Disraeli, a man known for his wit and style, was now leading a government that couldn't even protect its own workspace. The opposition had a field day, not just with political jabs, but with olfactory ones. One member famously declared that as he was entering a committee room, he was assailed by a smell which he could not describe, and that he could not remain more than a minute. Another quipped that the noble River Thames had become a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. This leads to a key historical debate. Was the decision to finally act a matter of genuine public concern, or was it purely a matter of self-interest? The cynical view, held by many historians, is that Parliament only acted when the problem literally arrived on their own doorstep and made their lives uncomfortable. For decades, reformers had pleaded. The poor had died in cholera epidemics, and scientists had warned of the dangers. All too little effect. The legislative machinery remained stuck in a mire of competing interests, cost concerns, and political apathy. But when the stench made it impossible for members of Parliament to conduct their business, suddenly the problem became urgent. In this view, the salvation of London was a direct result of the personal discomfort of a few hundred powerful men. A more generous interpretation argues that the Great Stink was the final, undeniable piece of evidence that broke through the political paralysis. It was such a dramatic, public, and humiliating spectacle that it created a rare moment of political consensus. The problem could no longer be debated or delegated to minor committees. It was a national emergency that required a bold, centralized solution. Disraeli, a shrewd politician, recognized this shift in the political wind and seized the moment. In this view, the MP's discomfort was not just selfish. It was representative of the entire city as suffering, and it finally gave them the political cover and the collective will to approve a solution that would have been previously unthinkable due to its enormous cost. On a particularly hot day in June 1858, with the stink at its absolute peak, Disraeli introduced a bill to Parliament. It was a proposal to grant the city's Metropolitan Board of Works the power and the funds to build a massive, modern sewage system, in a testament to the sheer desperation of the moment. The bill, which authorized millions of pounds in spending, a staggering sum at the time, was rushed through Parliament in just 18 days. The debate was over. The river had won, Parliament had been forced to surrender. The Great Stink had achieved what decades of death and disease could not. It had made the problem of London's filth too big, and too smelly, to ignore. With Parliament's panicked approval and a massive budget secured, the question becomes, who can possibly solve a problem of this magnitude? The city needs more than just a plan. It needs a visionary, an engineer with the boldness and brilliance to fundamentally reform the largest city on earth. The man for the job is Joseph Bazalgette, the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, and he is the hero of our story. This chapter is about the man and his audacious plan. Joseph Bazalgette is, in many ways, the perfect Victorian hero. Brilliant, determined, and obsessively hardworking. He had been toiling away at this problem for years, long before the Great Stink made it fashionable. He was a flamboyant public figure, but a meticulous engineer who understood the intricate topography of London and the immense challenge of the task. His vision, which he now finally has the mandate to build, is the main focus here. It is breathtaking in its scale and elegance. He doesn't just want to patch the existing system. He wants to create an entirely new one, a hidden underground superhighway for the city as waste. The plan is this. Instead of allowing the city's many existing sewers to empty into the Thames within the city limits, he will build a new network of massive interceptor sewers. These huge, brick-lined tunnels will run parallel to the river, one on the north side and one on the south. They will be carefully angled, using the power of gravity, to intercept the waste from the old sewers before it reaches the river. These interceptors will then carry the city's entire sewage load far downstream, to the east of the city. There, at two giant outfalls, Beckton on the north bank and Crossness on the south, the sewage will be held in massive reservoirs and then discharged into the river on the ebb tide, which would then carry it far out to sea. It was a plan that was both brutally simple in its concept and mind-bogglingly complex in its execution. A specific and brilliant detail of Bazalgette's design showcases his foresight. The 2-inch extra. When calculating the required diameter of these enormous tunnels, Bazalgette took the most generous estimates of London's future population growth and the volume of waste they would produce. Then, after all his calculations were complete, he famously said, "Well, we are only going to do this once and there is always the unforeseen." And he doubled the diameter of the pipes. Another account says he simply added an extra 2 inches of diameter for every foot of the tunnel's calculated requirement. Whatever the exact metric, the principle was the same. He massively over-engineered the system. This decision was an act of pure genius. It not only ensured the system could handle London's explosive growth for the next century, but it also, unintentionally, gave the system the capacity to handle the vast volumes of rainwater from modern storm drains, something Bazalgette could never have fully anticipated. The historical debate surrounding Bazalgette is less about his character. He is almost universally praised, and more about the nature of his achievement. Was he a lone genius, a single heroic figure who saved London? Or was he the product of a broader Victorian engineering culture? One school of thought champions the great man theory. It posits that without Bazalgette's unique combination of vision, political skill, and engineering prowess, the project would have failed or been a far less successful compromise. They point to his personal battles with politicians, his meticulous oversight of every detail, and his brilliant design choices as evidence of his indispensable role. The sewer system is his personal, monumental legacy. Another school of thought, while not diminishing Bazalgette, places him within a wider context. They argue that he was the beneficiary of a golden age of British engineering. This was the era of Isambard Kingdom Brunel and Robert Stevenson, a time of immense innovation in materials, like the mass production of cheap bricks in Portland cement, surveying techniques, and steam-powered machinery. Bazalgette stood on the shoulders of giants and had a vast pool of skilled contractors, foremen, and laborers, the navvies, to execute his plans. In this view, he was the brilliant conductor of a vast orchestra of Victorian industrial and engineering might. Rather than a solo performer, was the sewer system the work of one great mind, or the ultimate expression of an entire era's technical genius? You hear the talk in the streets, a new sense of cautious optimism replacing the fear and disgust of the great stink. They talk of the great drain, this subterranean miracle that is being planned. For you, it seems almost too good to be true. The idea that the filth could simply be made to disappear, to be whisked away by an unseen, underground river, is revolutionary. Joseph Bazalgette is not just proposing to build a sewer. He is proposing to fundamentally change London's relationship with its own waste. He is promising a future where the river might one day be clean again, where the air might be free from the threat of a fecal miasma. It is a promise of a new, cleaner, modern London, and it is about to be built, brick by painstaking brick, right under your feet. The talking is over, and the work begins. For the next decade and beyond, London becomes a city of construction. You witness the largest civil engineering project the world has ever seen unfold around you. The creation of Bazalgette's sewer system is our focus. A story of brute force, incredible ingenuity, and thousands of tons of brick and mortar. The city is turned upside down. Major thoroughfares are closed and transformed into vast, deep trenches. The noise of thousands of workers, the navvies, shouting, digging, and hammering becomes the new soundtrack of the city, replacing the panicked quiet of the great stink with the roar of progress. You see these navvies at work. They are the unsung heroes of this story. An army of laborers, many of them Irish immigrants, who physically built this underground world. The work is incredibly dangerous and physically demanding. They dig through a bewildering variety of London soil, gravel, sand, clay, and treacherous pockets of quicksand. They work by candlelight in the faint glow of early gas lamps, deep underground in cramped, often flooded tunnels. Cave-ins are a constant threat. So are pockets of flammable methane gas released from the disturbed soil. Explosions are not uncommon. It is a subterranean war against the chaos of the city's geology. The sheer scale of the operation is hard to comprehend. Over 80 miles, 130 kilometers, of massive, main interceptor sewers are built, requiring the excavation of 5 million cubic yards of earth to connect the existing sewers to these new interceptor. Over 100 miles, 800 kilometers, of smaller street sewers are constructed. The entire system is a vast, underground web, a hidden mirror image of the city above, and it is all done with steam-powered pumps, shovels, and human muscle. One of the most ingenious and specific details of the construction is the beautiful brickwork. If you were to go down into these sewers today, you would see that they are not just crude tunnels. They are masterpieces of Victorian bricklaying. The tunnels are gracefully curved, often egg-shaped, a design that is structurally strong and allows a faster flow even when the water level is low, making them self-cleaning. The quality of the craftsmanship is stunning, a testament to the skill of the bricklayers who worked in the dark, damp conditions. Bazalgette insisted on using the highest quality Portland cement, a new and powerful mortar that hardened even underwater. He would personally inspect the work, And if he found a single poorly laid brick or a weak patch of mortar, he would order the entire section to be torn down and rebuilt. This obsessive attention to quality is why his system is still functioning perfectly over 150 years later. This monumental project, however, was not without its controversies, which fuels a historical debate. Did the creation of the sewer system and the embankments built to house parts of it destroy as much as it saved? To build the Victoria, Albert, and Chelsea embankments, which carried the main interceptor sewers along the riverbank, huge swaths of the old, chaotic, and often impoverished riverfront communities had to be demolished. Entire neighborhoods of cheap housing, rickety workshops, and ancient pubs were swept away to make way for these grand, orderly, and sanitary new boulevards. Some social historians argue that this was a brutal act of social cleansing, disguised as a public health initiative. It displaced thousands of the city's poorest residents, pushing them into even more overcrowded slums further inland, all to create a beautiful, respectable riverfront for the middle and upper classes to promenade along. In this view, the project was as much about imposing social order and increasing property values as it was about public health. Others argue that this was a necessary, if painful, surgery. The demolished areas were some of the most unsanitary and dilapidated in the city, and their removal was essential for progress. They contend that while the short-term displacement was regrettable, the long-term public health benefits for the entire city, including the poor, far outweighed the cost. Was this urban renewal or social purification? As the years pass, you see the city transform. The huge trenches are filled in. The new embankments rise, elegant and strong, taming the river's muddy banks. The project is largely invisible, a silent revolution happening beneath your feet. But the effects start to become noticeable. The Thames, while still far from pristine, no longer smells like an open sewer. The constant, oppressive fear of a stench-driven plague begins to fade. You are living through a profound change. The city is being given a new set of bowels, a modern, efficient, hidden system to handle its own waste. It is a subterranean miracle, a testament to what a city can achieve when it is finally forced to confront the consequences of its own filth. The age of the great stink is over. The age of sanitation has begun. Bazalgette's sewers have performed a miracle beneath the ground. But when you look up, the air remains a problem. The Thames may no longer be a septic tank, but London is still the big smoke. The thousands of chimneys, both industrial and domestic, continue to pump out a thick, gray-brown haze of coal smoke and sulfur dioxide. The new sewer system has tackled the waterborne filth, but the airborne filth remains a constant, choking presence. This brings us to our next focus: the growing consciousness that fresh air itself was a precious and increasingly scarce commodity. While the miasma theory as a cause of cholera has been debunked, the general idea that polluted air is bad for your health persists, and for good reason. The pea super fogs, thick with certain chemicals, cause a spike in respiratory illnesses and deaths every winter. The high sulfur content in the air corrodes the stone of buildings, including the newly cleaned face of the Houses of Parliament. People understand, on a fundamental level, that the air of London is not healthy. This leads to a powerful cultural yearning for the countryside, for a place where one can breathe clean, fresh air. For the wealthy, the solution is simple: escape. They build villas in the burgeoning suburbs, which are now more accessible thanks to the expanding railway network. They take extended holidays in seaside towns like Brighton or in the Lake District, taking the air as a form of medical prescription. But for the vast majority of Londoners, including you. This is not an option. You are tied to the city for your work. The desire for clean air, therefore, manifests itself in a new and powerful civic movement, the creation of public parks. This is a specific and important development of the era, the Victorian Park movement. Reformers begin to argue that if people cannot go to the country must be brought to the people. They advocate for the creation of large, green spaces within the city, which they call the lungs of London. These parks, like Victoria Park in the East End, created specifically to serve the poor, and Battersea Park in the South, are designed as idealized miniature landscapes. They have rolling lawns, artfully arranged clusters of trees, serene boating lakes, and colorful flowers. They are intended as an antidote to the harsh, grimy, monotonous reality of the industrial city. On a Sunday, you can see thousands of working-class families flocking to these parks, enjoying a rare chance to walk on grass, sit under a tree, and breathe air that is at least marginally cleaner than that in their own neighborhood. This movement leads to a subtle historical debate. What was the primary motivation behind the creation of these public parks? Was it a genuinely altruistic public health initiative? Or was it a tool for social control? The public health argument is straightforward. The parks were designed to provide fresh air and a space for healthy recreation, combating diseases like tuberculosis and rickets, and providing a mental and physical respite from the stresses of urban life. They were a tangible investment in the well-being of the working classes. However, other historians argue that the parks were also designed to impose middle-class values on the workers. The park regulations were often strict. Keep off the grass signs were common. Drinking alcohol was forbidden, and organized sports were often restricted to designated areas. The winding paths and carefully curated natural landscapes were meant to encourage quiet, contemplative strolling, not the boisterous, unruly entertainments of the traditional street fair. In this view, the parks were an attempt to civilize the masses, to teach them how to use their leisure time in a respectable, orderly, and sober manner. Were the parks a gift of health, or a lesson in social discipline? You spend a Sunday afternoon in Victoria Park. The difference is palpable. The air feels lighter here. The constant grinding noise of the city is replaced by the sound of children laughing and the distant melody of a brass band. You lie on a patch of grass, on a section where it is permitted, of course, and look up at the sky. It still has a hazy, grayish tint, but through the leaves of a plane tree, it looks almost blue. For a few hours, you can escape. You can breathe a little deeper. The sewer system was a hidden, functional revolution. The parks are a visible, aesthetic one. They don't solve the problem of air pollution, not by a long shot, but they offer a sanctuary. They are an admission that the industrial city, left to its own devices, is an inherently unhealthy environment, and that nature, however tamed and curated, is not a luxury, but a necessity. The city is changing. The great sewer has cleansed the river, and the parks offer pockets of cleaner air. Now, another quiet revolution begins to take place, one that targets the grime on your own skin. You start to see posters for a new kind of establishment, and hear talk of a novel, almost luxurious experience becoming available not just to the rich, but to ordinary people. This is the rise of the public bath and wash house, a crucial step in the journey towards personal hygiene, and it is our focus for this chapter. For centuries, the idea of providing public facilities for the poor to wash themselves in their clothes was seen as a radical, almost utopian idea. But spurred on by the sanitary reform movement and the lingering fear of cholera. The Baths and Washhouses Act was passed in 1846. This act empowered local authorities to raise funds to build and run these establishments. The movement was slow to start, but by the latter half of the century, these buildings are becoming a more common sight in working-class neighborhoods. You decide to visit one. The building itself is often a grand, imposing brick structure, a palace of cleanliness designed to inspire civic pride. Inside, it is divided into sections. One section is the laundry, or washhouse. Here, for a small fee, women like your roommate's wife, Mary, can come and do their washing. Instead of the back-breaking ordeal at home, they have access to individual stalls equipped with large tubs, washboards, and, most importantly, a constant supply of hot and cold running water. There are also mechanical wringers, mangles, and large, heated drying rooms. This transforms the all-day domestic nightmare of laundry into a manageable task of a few hours. It is not just a convenience. It is a social hub, a place where women gather and talk while they work. The other section is the bathhouse. This is what you have come for. You pay your fee, perhaps a penny for a cold bath or 2 pence for a hot one, and you are given a key to a private, partitioned cubicle. Inside, there is a simple cast iron tub, a towel, and a small piece of soap. For you, who has only ever known the shared, grimy basin in your room, this is the height of luxury. The feeling of turning a tap and having a stream of hot water gush out is nothing short of miraculous. This is our main point. The public bath provided, for the first time, the 2 essential ingredients for true cleanliness that were denied to the poor: abundant hot water and privacy. Here is a specific, telling detail about these baths. The time limit, to ensure a high turnover and prevent people from lingering too long, or even trying to sleep in the warmth and privacy of the cubicle. There was usually a strict time limit, often around 30 minutes for a hot bath. A bell might be rung, or an attendant would knock on the door to let you know your time was up. This small rule highlights the fact that while this was a step towards modern hygiene, it was still a regulated, institutional experience, a world away from the leisurely, private bath at home that we take for granted. This innovation leads to a historical debate. What was the true impact of these public baths on public health? The optimistic view is that they were transformative. By providing a means for the working classes to finally get properly clean, they must have played a significant role in reducing the incidence of skin diseases, lice infestations, and other filth-related ailments. They were a direct, practical application of the new gospel of cleanliness and a major contributor to the dramatic rise in life expectancy seen in the late Victorian period. The pessimistic or more skeptical view argues that their impact was more limited. Historians in this camp point out that the number of baths was still small compared to the vast population, and many people only used them infrequently, perhaps once a week or even less. They argue that other, broader improvements, like better nutrition, the sewer system's impact on waterborne disease, and slum clearance projects, were far more significant factors in improving public health. In this view, the baths were symbolically important, representing a new civic ideal, but their direct, measurable impact on citywide disease statistics may have been modest. Was the public bath a key weapon in the war against disease, or was it more of a morale boost? You lower yourself into the hot water. The sensation is sublime. The heat soaks into your weary muscles. You take the small, rough bar of carbolic soap and begin to scrub away weeks of accumulated grime. You see the water around you turn gray, then dark brown. It is a disgusting, yet deeply satisfying sight. For the first time since you arrived in London, you feel thoroughly clean. When the knock comes on the door, you get out, your skin pink and tingling. As you step back out into the sooty London air, you know the cleanliness won't last long, but something has shifted. A bath is no longer an impossible dream. It is a commodity, something you can buy for a few pence. The revolution is happening not just in the ground and in the air, but on your very own skin. With the city's infrastructure for waste slowly being modernized, a new problem comes into sharp focus. It is the rubbish you see every day. The piles of household waste, ash from fireplaces, rotting food scraps, and discarded goods that clog up courtyards and are casually tossed into the street. For centuries, London had no formal, municipal system for collecting and disposing of solid waste. This brings us to our next major theme, the messy, chaotic birth of modern garbage collection. Historically, waste disposal was a haphazard affair. In a pre-industrial economy, there was very little waste in the modern sense. Food scraps were fed to pigs. Old rags were sold to be made into paper, and bones were boiled down for glue. Everything had a potential second life. The most significant component of household waste was ashen cinders from coal fires. This material was collected by private contractors known as dustmen. This was the public service. The dustmen actually paid households a small amount for their dust, because it was a valuable commodity. This is our specific and slightly surprising detail. The dust heap. The dustmen would haul the collected ash and refuse to huge, sprawling mounds on the outskirts of the city. These dust heaps, immortalized in Charles Dickens' novel Our Mutual Friend, were veritable mountains of garbage, but they were also mountains of money. At the dust yard, teams of sifters would meticulously sort through the refuse. The fine ashen cinders were sold to brickmakers to be mixed with clay, or to farmers as fertilizer. Bones, rags, metals, and glass were all separated and sold to their respective industries. These enormous, stinking piles of garbage were complex, profitable industrial sites, a grimy testament to the Victorian genius for recycling. However, by the mid-19th century, this system was breaking down. The city was growing too fast, and the sheer volume of waste was becoming overwhelming. Furthermore, the nature of waste was changing. With more mass-produced goods, people were throwing away more things that couldn't be easily recycled. The old dust heaps, once on the edge of the city, were now being swallowed by urban expansion, becoming a foul-smelling, insignificant nuisance to their new neighbors. The city was drowning in its own trash, and the private, for-profit system could no longer cope. This crisis forced the authorities to act, leading to the beginning of municipal waste collection. Local V.S. Ryerson. Later, borough councils began to take over the responsibility of collecting household refuse, funding it through local taxes. You start to see uniformed workers with municipal carts making regular rounds, a service provided to all, not just a transaction for valuable dust. This shift from a private, for-profit system to a public service is the core of this chapter. It marks a fundamental change in how the city viewed its own garbage, from a resource to be exploited to a problem to be managed. The historical debate here centers on what to do with the collected waste. Once the municipality has your garbage, where does it go? This was a fierce and long-running debate. One faction advocated for incineration. They proposed building large destructors, giant furnaces that would burn the city's waste, ideally using the heat generated to produce electricity. This seemed like a clean, modern, scientific solution. Another faction was horrified by this idea, arguing that burning the rubbish would only add to the city's already horrific air pollution. They championed landfill, using the waste to fill in old quarries or marshland, reclaiming useless land for future development. This seemed like a practical, economical solution. The debate was intense. Should London's waste be sent up into the air as smoke, or buried down in the ground as landfill? This argument between incineration and landfill, which began in the late 19th century, continues in cities all over the world to this day, showing just how fundamental and enduring this challenge is. You watch one of the new municipal carts trundle down your street. Two men, employed by the parish, move from door to door, emptying the dust bins that people are now encouraged to use. It is a slow, laborious process, but it is organized. It is systematic. The piles of rotting refuse that once choked the street corners are beginning to shrink. Like the sewer system, this is another invisible revolution. It is the creation of a system that takes the problem of waste away. You don't know if it is being burned or buried, and you probably don't care. All you know is that for the first time, the city is taking responsibility for the rubbish it creates. It is another crucial step in the long, slow process of making the urban environment livable. The changes you have witnessed, the sewers, the parks, the bales, the garbage collection, are not just physical. They are accompanied by a powerful new force, advertising. As you walk through the city, you notice that the walls, the newspapers, and the sides of omnibuses are plastered with a new kind of message. It is a message of cleanliness, a promise of personal transformation through a purchasable product. This is the rise of the gospel of cleanliness, spread not just by sanitary reformers, but by savvy capitalists who see a huge new market opening up. This commercialization of hygiene is our focus. For the first time, soap is being mass-produced and marketed, not as a generic commodity, but as a branded product with almost magical properties. You see advertisements for Pear's soap, with its famous slogan, "Good morning. Have you used Pear's soap?" The ads often feature angelic, rosy-cheeked children or beautiful, fair-skinned women. Their pristine complexions implicitly linked to the use of this specific soap. The message is clear. Cleanliness is not just about avoiding disease. It is about beauty, respectability, and social aspiration. Using the right soap can make you a better person. This is a profound shift. Previously, filth was a fact of life, and cleanliness was a laborious struggle. Now, cleanliness is being presented as a lifestyle choice, an identity you can purchase. The ads don't just sell soap. They sell an ideal. They tap into the anxieties and aspirations of a society in flux. For the working class, using a bar of branded soap is a small way to participate in the new culture of respectability. For the burgeoning middle class, it is a way to affirm their status and distinguish themselves from the great and washed. One of the most specific and slightly bizarre product categories to emerge in this era is carbolic soap. Following the work of Joseph Lister on antiseptic surgery, carbolic became a powerful buzzword, synonymous with scientific, germ-killing power. Brands like Life Beway soap heavily marketed their carbolic content, with ads that often featured brave doctors or nurses fighting invisible germs. The strong, medicinal smell of carbolic acid, once associated with hospitals and disinfection, was now skillfully rebranded as the scent of safety and modern, scientific cleanliness. People learned to associate that specific, chemical smell with being truly, deeply clean, a world away from the flowery, perfumed soaps of the past. It was the smell of progress. The historical debate here examines the social consequences of this new gospel of cleanliness. On one hand, It undoubtedly had positive effects. The mass marketing of soap and other cleaning products encouraged better personal hygiene habits and played a role in improving public health. It helped to democratize cleanliness, making it more accessible and desirable for everyone. The advertising campaigns, for all their commercial motives, acted as a powerful form of public health education, popularizing the link between germs, dirt, and disease in a way that dry scientific papers never could. On the other hand, many historians argue that this new ideology had a darker side. It created new social anxieties and reinforced class and racial prejudices. Advertising often starkly contrasted the clean, white, civilized consumer with images of the dirty, dark-skinned other, both at home and in the colonies. One infamous ad for Pear's soap depicted a black child being scrubbed in a tub until he turned white. Cleanliness became equated with moral and racial superiority. It also created a new burden, particularly for women, who were targeted by the advertising and were now expected to meet an ever-increasing standard of domestic and personal cleanliness. Failure to do so was seen not just as a practical failing, but a moral one. Was the gospel of cleanliness a great liberator from filth, or a new tool for social judgment and control? You look at a colorful poster showing a happy family in a sparkling clean home, a bar of soap held up like a holy relic. The image is a world away from the reality of your own grimy, shared room, but the message is seductive. It suggests that the path to a better life, to health and happiness and social acceptance, can begin with something as simple as a bar of soap. The battle against London's filth is no longer just a top-down, civic engineering project. It is now a bottom-up, consumer-driven movement. The revolution is being privatized, one advertised bar of soap at a time. You find yourself standing on one of the new embankments as the 19th century draws to a close. It is evening, and the gas lamps cast a warm, golden glare on the wide, clean pavement. You look out at the River Thames. It is no longer the foul-smelling, debris-choked sewer you first encountered. It is a dark, majestic river, its surface reflecting the city lights. Boats pass by, their lights twinkling. The air, while still carrying the familiar tang of coal smoke, is free from the oppressive, gut-wrenching stench of sewage. You take a deep breath, and for the first time, it doesn't feel like an act of aggression against your own lungs. This is our final scene, a moment of reflection, standing on the cusp of a new era, looking back at the journey from filth to relative cleanliness. The London you now inhabit is a world transformed from the one you first entered. The change is not total, not perfect, but it is profound. The fundamental relationship between the city and its own waste has been re-engineered. The great scourges of the mid-century, the filth-borne epidemics that terrified the population, have been largely tamed. The invisible enemy of cholera, which once swept through the city like a wildfire, has been defeated, not by magical miasma fighting fumes, but by the straightforward, unglamorous, and brilliant engineering of clean water in undirty water out. The death rate has fallen dramatically. Life expectancy is rising. A child born in London now has a far better chance of surviving to adulthood than ever before. You think back to the specific horrors you witnessed. The overflowing cesspool beneath your floorboards is gone, replaced by a connection to a silent, efficient sewer. The single, grimy basin of water for a whole family's wash is being replaced by the possibility of a hot, private bath at the public bathhouse. The lice-infested clothes, worn for weeks on end, are giving way to a new standard where weekly washing, aided by mass-produced soap in public laundries, is becoming the norm. The treacherous streets, once paved with a slurry of mud and manure, are now regularly swept and maintained. The terror of the Broad Street pump has been replaced by a growing, if not yet universal, trust in the water that comes from the tap. A lesser-known but crucial sign of this change is the return of life to the Thames. In the 1852, the river was biologically dead. By the 1882, after Bazalgette jet sewers had been operating for some years, fishermen began to report catching fish, smelt, flounder, and eels within the central parts of London for the first time in decades. This small, ecological recovery was a powerful symbol. It was tangible proof that the monumental effort had worked. The river was breathing again. It was a small, hopeful sign that the damage done to the environment was not necessarily permanent. This leads us to our final historical contemplation, the complex legacy of the Victorian sanitary revolution. It is easy to look back and see it as a straightforward story of progress, a triumphant march of science and engineering over ignorance and filth. And in many ways, it was. But it is also a story full of contradictions. The very industrial capitalism that produced the unprecedented filth also produced the wealth. Technology, like Portland cement and steam engines, and engineering genius required to clean it up. The solution grew from the same soil as the problem. Furthermore, historians compel us to ask what new problems these solutions created. The sewer system, a marvel of gravity and engineering, simply moved the problem further downstream, concentrating the pollution at the outfalls and creating new ecological black spots in the Thames estuary. The doctrine for cleanliness and order led to slum clearances that displaced the poor. The gospel of cleanliness, promoted by advertisers, created new social anxieties and prejudices. The Victorians solved the problem of human waste, but they did so by embracing a new, massive reliance on burning fossil fuels, which would create a whole new set of environmental challenges for future generations to face. The story of hygiene in London isn't one of a problem solved, but of a problem transformed. You turn your back to the river and look at the city. It is a city that has survived a near-death experience. It has confronted its own filth and, through a combination of crisis, genius, anger, and sheer determination, it has begun to clean up its act. The journey has been long and brutal, and the work is far from over. But the air of apocalyptic dread is gone. London is no longer defined by the great state, but by the great drain that lies silent and powerful beneath its streets. You walk into the electric glow of the approaching 20th century, a survivor of an era that nearly choked on its own progress, leaving the worst of the filth behind you, a bad smell and the fading memory of history. And so, our long walk through the muck and grime of 19th century London comes to an end. You can finally rest, far from the noise, the smoke, and the ever-present threat of the water pump. The journey was a sensory one, filled with the harsh realities that lay beneath the polished veneer of an era. But now, that world of grit and miasma begins to fade, its sharp edges softening as you drift deeper into your own quiet space. But the lingering images, the dark river, the flickering gas lamps, the faint smell of coal smoke, dissolve into the soft fabric of your dreams. The frantic energy of the industrial city gives way to a gentle, calming stillness. The clatter of iron wheels on cobblestones becomes a distant, rhythmic hum, as faint and steady as your own breathing. You are no longer witness to that struggle for cleanliness, but an observer of your own peaceful, inner landscape. The story is over. The sounds are fading. There is only the quiet, the comfort of your bed, and the gentle pull of a deepened restorative sleep. The great, noisy, dirty city is now silent, a ghost in a story that has been told. Allow yourself to drift away from its shores. towards the quiet harbor of your dreams.